Today, for our Faculty FaceTime Friday, we have Dr. Leyva and Nisha. Dr. Leyva is a professor in the Teaching and Learning Department here at Peabody, and Nisha is one of our wonderful students. So the layout for today is that basically Nisha's gonna ask Dr. Leyva some questions, but this is like a conversational format, so feel free to hop in, ask questions in the chat, and we'll make sure we try to get to everyone. So I'm gonna pass it over to Nisha, and let's go.
Hi everyone. I'm excited. Also, we don't have very much room for questions, but we do have a lot of room for questions, and we're hoping that our questions sort of stimulate questions in and of themselves. So keep an ear out and feel free to put things in the chat box. So my first question is sort of about this unique time that we're at. Focusing on the context of COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter protests, how do you find that your work influences your understanding of this time? And how do you see this time informing the various facets of your work in the future?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. And I want to say thank you to the EDI office for organizing. Courtney, thanks for the introduction. Taylor, for all of your leadership, and everybody at the office. And thank you all for joining on today's call. It's Friday, it's the summer, and so I recognize that. So the fact that y'all are joining makes my heart really full. And so to launch us off, this question comes from this sense of this moment in time and this time point in history. And much of my work really is grounded in this methodology called counter storytelling, which comes from critical race theory. And it really is this methodological perspective of really centering the lived experiences of those who are at the margins to be able to then theorize around some of those experiences to dismantle interlocking systems of power and oppression in our society and in education, particularly in my work. And I use this counter storytelling methodology to be able to write complex intersectional humanities into existence, and being able to write those into existence in the education spaces, but also in society. So as I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter, and as I'm thinking about COVID, I'm thinking about a lot of how media, healthcare, and educational approaches may not necessarily be cognizant of some of those intersectional humanities, right? So when we think about, for instance, the Black Lives Matters movement, I often think about who are the leaders behind some of that. So there's some intersectional foundations to that movement. The three organizers, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometri, are Black women coming from epistemologies of Black womanhood, but also complex intersectionalities in the sense of two of them identifying as queer and one of them being from Nigeria. So when we think about this notion of Blackness to the Black Lives Matters movement, we have to think about how we're taking up Blackness in a really complex way. And so thinking about, the Say Her Name movement, for example, right? And so in the spirit of that, I'm actually going to paste into the chat some names. Right, and so this movement around being able to put into the fore Black women who have been subjected to police brutality, right? And in that same spirit, we have the Say Their Names movement when we think about Black trans humanities that we've unfortunately lost for the same circumstances. And so when we think about Black Lives Matter, right, I'm thinking about how that movement and the parallels of Black feminist organizing like the Combahee River Collective, right? So that was a Black lesbian feminist movement that really catapulted a lot of our intersectional thinking about issues that are at the juncture of racism, at the juncture of anti-Blackness, at the juncture of heteropatriarchy in our society, and how those standpoints really informed and mobilized a lot of intersectional inquiry and justice in society. And so as I'm thinking about this movement in and of itself and the complexities of that, I think about some of the parallels and the intersectional foundation that we had through something like the Combahee River Collective. That was a movement back in the late 1970s when these women were thinking the civil rights movement is really not recognizing the needs of Black women. And when we look at the feminist movement, it's not recognizing that either. So how are we being able to then organize an opportunity to really complicate the sense of womanhood and the sense of Blackness across these movements that really center those perspectives? In regards to COVID, I'm thinking about some of the work that the African American Policy Foundation Initiative is currently doing. So I'm going to paste the URL here into the chat. So the idea of there's a series called Under the Black Light, the Intersectional Failures that COVID Lays Bare. And they have a series of different episodes where they bring in many thinkers in the present moment. We have like Jonathan Metzl from Vanderbilt, for example. We had Eduardo Bonilla Silva. We had Rosa Clemente, who is a community activist, who are in dialogue and wrestling with issues around, from a sociological standpoint, from a medical standpoint, around how COVID is impacting various humanities, and how this lens, this intersectional lens, allows us to better understand how COVID is really impacting different individuals and different communities in very different ways. And so for me, when I'm thinking about my research in relation to Black Lives Matter and in relation to COVID in this moment in time, I think about how my work writes people and their full intersectional selves into existence and values their humanities at the fore in much the same ways that we need to be thinking about the social movement and this global pandemic in a very complex way. Oh, I think you might be on mute.
Thank you. I was actually going to say, I think I'm going to allow for a second of silence because I think that that is maybe a lot of valuable points that you made. So I'll let that sit. All right. My next question focuses a little bit more specifically about your research work, and you involve a lot of these methodologies of critical race theory and intersectionality, methodologies that we don't really see typically in STEM education research. And I wanted to sort of explore that a little bit, and also how you find that you bring yourself into your research.
So in terms of bringing myself, I think this is probably going to be a thread across our faculty FaceTimes, because we mentioned this paper in our last one with Dr. Rich Milner, but Dr. Rich Milner has an excellent piece published in Educational Researcher around offering a framework to the field, really, around how you think about your own positionality in doing critical work as a researcher. And so he kind of frames this from around these ideas of dangers that are seen, unseen, and unforeseen. And so for me, I have to really think about how when I go into this work, and much of my work, as I said before, is really centering the lives of historically marginalized students at intersections of race, gender, and sexual identities, particularly in STEM higher education. I mainly do interviews through my data collection, right? And so much of that space is really a space where I have to think about not being able to assume that I know, especially thinking about maybe participants who self-identify as me in similar ways, right? Because I have to remember that I have to kind of hold my own experiences and open myself to really learn, right, from their own perspectives. Because even though there might be mutual identifications, our humanities are very complex, and there might be things that I'm not necessarily aware of, right, from that standpoint. So I think about, when I think about my own positionality in relation to Milner's work, I'm thinking about the dangers that I might be running into if I draw an assumption of mutually identifying, where I'm closing doors of opportunities to really understand this unique intersectional lived experience. Another piece that I have to do in relation to the work is interrogate my own selfhood. So we're all complex people. And even people who are doing critical work, we have to self-interrogate our own selves. To do the work requires self-work. And so much of what I have to do is think about, how much do I subscribe to notions of systems of power? How much my own ways of upbringing or my own ways of seeing the world might be complicit in ways that white supremacy works in our world, in the ways that heteropatriarchy works in our world, in the ways that cis heteropatriarchy works in our world. So I have to really begin to do that work. So part of what I do to be able to do this work is, number one, read, and also be in community when I'm reading and writing, right? So being able to like open yourself to being challenged by peers, either senior peers, near peers, being in communication, being in partnership with research lab members that I'm fortunate to be a part of on Vanderbilt's campus, because I think that being able to do this work together in community and bringing these different perspectives to be able to push and help each other to see where we might not be seeing certain things from our own perspectives and our own positionalities is really important. So I think that that's really crucial, and honestly, stay humble, right? So for me, when I am doing this work, I'm always approaching the work from a stance of always learning and a stance of humility with doing this work. And so I think that that's important. And I think one last thing I think I might say, when you had mentioned the question about like these methods and these perspectives might not necessarily be the mainstream in math education or in STEM education. So I see my role as a researcher as taking an educative stance. So when I'm writing about this stuff, intersectionality came from Black feminist thought. When we're thinking about beginning to queer issues in this space, we're coming from women's and gender and sexual studies, right? And when we're thinking about counter storytelling, we're coming from critical legal theory and critical race theory. Those are things that are outside of the math ed and STEM ed discipline. So my responsibility as a researcher is to support my colleagues in the field in partnership with them of understanding where are these ideas coming from and how are they intimately wedded into the phenomenon that I'm trying to model through my work, right? And so how is it that these things that exist outside of the discipline can help us to really begin to complicate and further understand issues in math education and in STEM education more broadly, that we really need those tools outside of the discipline to be able to advance equity and social justice in our field.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that might be important to a lot of the people reading is not just how you do your research, but what it says, especially since a lot of your research is situated within a classroom and building an equitable classroom. So what goes into building an equitable math classroom?
So in mathematics, we often think of it as a discipline that's asocial, and think of it as a discipline that's culturalist. And so oftentimes we think about only around content instruction. And so if we're thinking about this in like a traditional way that we think about our classroom spaces, but when we erase social aspects of learning, we're also perpetuating the silencing of those whose ideas and who believe that they don't belong are actually further marginalized, right? So when we think about like the curriculum that we're developing, to what extent might you see perspectives different from the mainstream or from those in systems of power being reflected in the curricular space, right? How do you create opportunities for your students to think about where do those mathematical ideas come from? Whose mathematics are we learning? And so in a math classroom space, not only being able to kind of have it represented, but also allowing your students to be able to develop critical thinking skills to interrogate where are these particular mathematical concepts coming from. The second thing is, in relation to math kind of being in this asocial space, we oftentimes really put at the peripheries the value of relational aspects of teaching, right? So it's this idea about I just have to teach math and I don't necessarily have to forge relationships with my students. And I think, I do a lot of work in higher education, and I do a lot, much of my work has been in like large research universities and big math classroom spaces where logistically it's already hard as it is to be able to develop relationships with students. So how are you creatively using office hours as a space to build relationships with students? How are you creating opportunities, maybe even within your instruction, for students to talk to each other, right? So if students are already coming into these classrooms with preconceived ideas about who is mathematically able and who's not, by you just being able to open up the space in your math classroom spaces to just talk to each other, you might actually be able to kind of disrupt some of those ideas just by having opportunities for students to talk to somebody different, right, in the classroom space. And not kind of, oftentimes I see this like pattern in large math classes in higher ed, where students will always sit in the same spot with their friends, right? So how are we beginning to open up some of that space as well? And so I would say, the relational aspects of teaching are really important to think about. And I also think that this idea about silence, so like when we think about teaching content, if we don't name aspects of race and gender in our teaching practices, it doesn't mean that because we're not naming it, we're not complicit in it, right? So how do we create opportunities to be able to wrestle with some of those ideas in a math classroom space where you do make space for the social aspects alongside the content aspects of instruction?
Awesome. And my last question for you is, I think, a little bit more sort of in terms of your journey. And I think that I'm not the only person among this group of people who seems to come to you as a mentor. And I think that that is some sort of testament to the power of mentorship. And I'd love for you to talk about your own journey with mentorship and what that means to you in your career.
So mentorship is huge for me. I think that for me, and I thank you for your kind words about perceiving me as in that way on the Peabody campus community. And for me, I always think of mentorship as a way of kind of giving back and paying it forward, because I did have a lot of mentors. I never just had one mentor. I feel I'm always of the philosophy that you can never just have one mentor, because people will bring different aspects to you and enriching your life from different perspectives. And so if I have the opportunity to be able to do that in return, I'm grateful. I think that there's many people who are mentors to me who might not even know that they're mentors, but if you know me, I consciously tell you that you're my mentor because I want you to know that you were my mentor. And I think that I don't think of mentorship as hierarchical. So sometimes we think of mentors as somebody who's like older than you, who's your advisor. Those could be mentors, but my peers are my mentors, right? So when I started at Vanderbilt, I came in a cluster hire with two fellow colleagues, Nicole Joseph and Tesha Singh Irving. And we all, we're near peers, we're peer colleagues, but they are my mentors, right? When I think about the research lab, PRISM, that I'm affiliated with, those are graduate students with whom I'm working with and undergraduate students. I learned so much from them. And so to them, I consider them mentors as well. And so I think, in terms of advice, I always think about when you're thinking about reaching out to someone to connect, helping them to see don't think of it as this transactional thing, like I need this from you, right? Sometimes beautiful mentorships happen just from the fact that you're connecting with people. It's the relational aspects of mentorship, right? And so I think that's one thing really important to consider. And another thing is that the same way that one mentor can't bring everything to you, maybe this is a space where you can only bring certain aspects of yourself, right? Like to that mentoring relationship. And that's okay. Because I think that there's also this like self-preservation that we don't always have to be fully on in our intersectional selfhood in those mentoring spaces, right? So Rich Milner last week had shared like some of his mentors may not necessarily look like him and also love like him, right? So thinking about how we think about who those mentors are that don't necessarily always have to be those with whom we mutually identify.
Awesome. Thank you so much for elucidating your worldview so thoroughly. I think it's been really illuminating to get a view into how you navigate a lot of aspects, sort of for the people who are a little bit following in your stead. I have other questions, but I want to give space for other people to ask questions. So if you have any, go ahead and put them in the chat box right now, or go ahead and, I guess, turn yourself off of mute. But in the meantime, I guess I can keep asking questions. Could you actually tell us a little bit more about your work at the PRISM Research Lab? I think that might be of interest.
Yeah, so PRISM stands for Power, Resistance, and Identity in STEM Education. And so we're a group of researchers who really are interrogating interlocking systems of oppression, particularly in math education, but STEM higher education more broadly. And so we have different projects that we're working on. So most recently, we just are wrapping up a Queer Students of Color in STEM project that we're now fortunate enough to receive some funding to expand into a multi-institutional study that we're going to be expanding into historically white universities and minority serving institutions. And so that project really begins to interrogate and develop what I call queer of color counter stories, where students who are in engineering, computing, and mathematical science majors are thinking about instructional practices as well as student support practices that are affirming or disaffirming of their own intersectional selfhoods. So how can we then begin to speak back to inform faculty and student support leaders on our campuses in thinking about designing teaching and learning practices as well as student support practices in more affirming ways. So that's an example of one project. We have another project called Courage. We're all about acronyms. So Courage stands for Challenging, Operationalizing, and Understanding Racialized and Gendered Events in Undergraduate Mathematics Education. And that project is a partnership with Rutgers University. So it's a collaborative National Science Foundation grant. And what we're really doing is we're looking at, we're really centering the students' perspectives as well as instructors' perspectives around instructional practices that are taken up in entry-level mathematics courses, so particularly pre-calculus and calculus classrooms, and beginning to kind of disentangle ways in which students are thinking about these instructional practices as being either socially affirming or being socially disaffirming. So we take a look at practices that oftentimes got rendered as being neutral and quite commonplace. So one of the events that we have in our analysis is called the course drop event, where an instructor says something along the lines of, if you can't do this fast enough, you should consider dropping down a level in calculus or not pursuing second semester calculus. And so there's so many different reactions that we get from students about this. You know, sometimes students might say, I look around at who's represented in this classroom space and I think about this being like a self-fulfilling prophecy of maybe that I don't belong in math classroom spaces, or STEM isn't for me. Or students might say, you know what, that instructor's looking out for me. And so there's kind of this like air of like benevolence of like this, you know, maybe this isn't for me, maybe I do have to drop down. And so these kinds of instructional moments that at face value are racially neutral and gender neutral, but students from historically marginalized backgrounds, when you think about how those get coupled with the operations of stereotypes and the operations of statistical representation on campuses and in STEM fields broadly, they then actually operate to reinforce some of the racialized and gendered violence of math instruction in higher education. So those are two kind of samplings in terms of inquiry. Really the way that I position my work is twofold. I look at teaching and learning practices. So what are we actually doing to inform change in our classroom spaces? And in my career before I started at Vanderbilt, for folks who know me, I have a huge student affairs heart. I worked for a number of years in living learning communities, in summer bridge programs. And so in those opportunities, that's where I really began to appreciate this idea that a STEM experience is both academic and social at the same time. So while my work really speaks to teaching and learning, it also begins to speak to college student development and opportunities to be able to really integrate the classroom space with students' broader experiences on campus as well.
Thank you. I'm going to read out questions in the chat just so that we have a copy of it on the recording in the future. So Professor Needham asked, I love what you said about fostering relationships with students in your classes. Do you have suggestions for how to do that online while teaching online?
Yeah, so a very timely question, right? So I think that so when we launched into online, for me, when I was teaching, I think I don't know, this is so weird. Now with all of this that's happening around our world, I feel so much more connected. And maybe this is part of my introvertedness, but I feel so much more connected to people now than ever before. And I just think that there's a certain level of intentionality now of reaching out. And so for me, I authentically wanted to know how students were doing. So being able to reach out via email and just being able to just do a check-in and just see how folks are doing. I think even that, like even going back to the office hour example that I shared before, you know, oftentimes when students share about their experiences, they'll share things like, my professor reached out to me, and that never happens. And so this level of like personalizing the classroom classroom experience in a way that isn't necessarily just based on the instructional aspects, but how do we open up some structures like an email that oftentimes is just like, I need to get an answer, let me just get this answer. But how do we approach emailing in a more humanizing way, especially during circumstances like this? Even before COVID, I actively engage email in this way. Just checking in with students and being able to say, like, hey, during class, I kind of felt like I'm all about energy. So it's like your energy was different than it has been before. And I just want to know, like, just doing an energy check, you know what I mean? And so I think that for me, if my students are able, and I never expect my students to be fully 100% on, because you know what, we have our days, right? But at least I can do my due diligence as an instructor to be able to say, hey, like, what's going on? Like, can I be there for you? And there's other fantastic members of the faculty here who can also share maybe some perspectives from there. And I also have former students on this call right now. And so maybe I'm overlooking something that I've done, and even share things that I could have done better. So I'll open that up.
As someone that took like a methods class, I feel like what I love about Peabody methods class, and I feel like what some people that aren't ed majors might not like, is that we are treated like students sometimes. And I kind of love that, because I think it built a community for us where we were treated as students in the way that Professor Leyva was modeling to us how he would teach an elementary math class. So we would split into small groups and really like do a lot of like, creativity, but like manipulatives. We would discover the math for ourselves, which really, really changed the way I wanted to teach math and built community within our classroom, while also showing us how to build community in our future classrooms. And also just, he was a great professor and did check in as well. But I thought that was like through the modeling, through the methods, functioned in both ways.
Okay. If other people want to have more to say on that topic, you can also put it in the chat box if you want to add on to it, and then we can maybe come back to it again. I'm going to read out the next question, which is from Connor, which says, I wonder how learning about the history of mathematicians is helpful towards traditionally marginalized students. Two examples that come to mind for me: how does learning that Jenkins was a Nazi useful, and learning that Hausdorff was killed in the Holocaust as a Jew useful?
Yeah, so I think this kind of relates to the piece about like how are you representing the curriculum in your math classroom space, and how do we make space for history in math classroom spaces? I think one thing that I really have been seeing a lot as an uptick in math departments and some of my Twitter followings is math professors or math faculty who are having students read about some, like maybe it's a historical piece, maybe it is an educational piece, where they begin to then develop some critical thinking behind like what are some of the roots behind what we're learning. And so I think that oftentimes we engage in this interesting disciplinary siloing in higher education. And we even see that even too in P through 12, right? Where maybe some of those conversations are only reserved for a social studies classroom, but they're not necessarily relevant or perceived to be relevant in a math classroom space. So when we begin to kind of have this really conscious way of decolonizing mathematics as a domain, I think that even those moves that you can make as an instructor, I even see that now with working with students in STEM classrooms beyond mathematics, where, I'm just thinking about one student who had shared that they were taking a chemistry class, and it was like a standout moment. The faculty member had just shared like having them read a philosophical piece that had some kind of tangential way of relating to like stoichiometry. But I had said, well, why was that meaningful for you? And they had shared that it was the first time ever that they were in a STEM class where they got to engage with things that wasn't just like the core content of that class. So I think if there's some intentionality there that faculty members can do through their practices to disrupt some of the ways that we engage in these binaries of what is STEM and what is not STEM, that oftentimes also communicates implicitly whether you are a STEM person or not a STEM person, right? So how do your funds of knowledge get reflected in these curricular and instructional experiences. And if they're not, that's also implicitly communicating something to students about their identities in this space.
Extremely.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, and thanks for coming.
Actually, this ties in really well to our next question, which is from Felicia, incoming higher ed doctoral student, who says, first, thank you so much for sharing more about yourself and your work. As I've centered Indigenous epistemologies in my research, I experienced pushback, particularly around the legitimacy of Indigenous frameworks. Have you experienced pushback? If so, how have you maintained and supported your approach?
Yes. Part of the game is the critiques, right, and the pushbacks. I think that in math education, we have an age-old question of where is the math, particularly for scholars who are engaging in equity-minded practices, that we always have to do this this labor of having to show where the mathematics is when we're engaged in socio-political inquiry of mathematics. And so I think a big pushback, and I'm sure that there's other folks on this call who are really doing equity-minded work that know about this, like how is the work that you're doing with a social justice-oriented bent, whether it's student identity, whether it's teacher learning practices, right? How are these things mathematical in nature? And my argument to some of that is always much of the ways that this gets trickled down to teaching practices and how students make sense of themselves as people in mathematical spaces is oftentimes intimately tethered to the actual values of the domain. So when we think about mathematics, we think about individualism, right? We think about this idea of it being asocial. We think about it as this idea that either you have the math gene or you don't have the math gene. And so when we think about this idea about, grades and the competition with grades and how those things can easily become racialized and gendered experiences in the classroom space, that is rooted in the notion that mathematics has been constructed as this domain that you do things by yourself. It's not a collaborative endeavor. And so you have to demonstrate that you are mathematically able. And when it's constructed as something that you either have or you don't, then we get into this idea of how students are experiencing mathematics in these very inequitable ways. And so I think that the question kind of gets rooted in this idea about indigeneity and like forms of knowledge. The forms of knowledge in terms of mathematical knowledge might not necessarily be commensurable, right? And so how do we begin to then challenge what are we taking up as mathematics, right? And how do we broaden what mathematics is and whose mathematics we're learning? And so I think that, yes, I think that in the field, there's pushback. When I've published, there's been pushback, right? So when I first got to Vanderbilt, there was an uptick from social conservative kinds of media around my questioning around the operations of white supremacy and gender being socially constructed. And so there's like these ideas that we are kind of tethered to what mathematics is. And when we begin to kind of disrupt some of those understandings of what mathematics is, we kind of see this resistance and this pushback with that work.
So Oscar asks, how do you find yourself presenting and sharing your findings and suggestions, albeit wisdom, to practicing teachers in the classroom?
Great question. So I always think of my research as if I'm not changing the game of teaching and learning experiences, I'm not doing my job. So for me, what I try to do in terms of like supporting professional development, I'm thinking about this in relation to the Courage project that I was sharing before. When we're thinking about doing professional development with instructors, with math instructors, we actually present some of the instructional moments that were captured in this collection of different events that students had journaled about. And these events were instructional moments that they found to be either positive or negative in relation to their mathematical persistence, either in the class or as being STEM majors. And so that level of detail about that, the course drop event, for example, that I shared before, like that level of detail allows faculty and allows teachers to really value this moment. Maybe it's a very patterned behavior in their instruction, right? So other kinds of moments that we have is, oftentimes we think about entry-level math classroom spaces as spaces where you just don't have time to talk about all the content. You have to cover the content quickly because they have to move on. And so sometimes you see students' questions going unanswered, right? And so these are moments that we can bring up that are oftentimes frequently occurring in classroom spaces, but that students are reading in ways that could be potentially marginalizing. And I think that level of specificity helps, right? Helps teachers to really get a more concrete way of understanding what can they do on Monday, right? So that I think if they're able to kind of think through what are the specific things, behaviors or actions or approaches, and so these like instructional moments give that bite-sized piece to understanding that, we move away from this broad sweeping claim of treat everybody nice. We're never gonna get away. We're never gonna improve change if we just do that, right? How are we as faculty members and as teachers engaging in more socially conscious practices and thinking about when I say this or when I do this, how is that implicating someone's sense of belongingness in the space? How is that implicating someone's sense of identity in this space? And so I'm really hopeful that being able to engage with this methodology that I had that cuts across my work called event journaling, I'm trying to capture these slithers of moments in instruction and these moments that happen on campus. So that way when I'm speaking to teachers, like Oscar's raising in the question, or when I'm speaking to folks who are in student support capacity. So when I'm talking to the director of LGBTQ Life, when I'm talking to the director of a multicultural center, I'm really able to then bring up these specific moments that happen to help them to think about more socially conscious efforts to be able to support students and to engage in equitable teaching and learning experiences.
We can't hear you.
Got it. We have room for more questions for those who still have them, but for now, I'm going to go back to my bank of questions. So we've been talking about this a little bit, but what are sort of recommendations or truisms that you hear in your field that you want to challenge or question?
All right, math ed, STEM ed people, help me out here. What are we trying to challenge in our field? I see Nadav on the call. I see Dr. Joseph. I see Alex on the call.
Oh, I thought you were just kidding. This is your question. Go ahead, Nadav.
I think Nadav, Dr. Joseph was like kind of handing you the mic to speak on this if you wanted to.
That's me being a good pedagogue, trying to, share space. Go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I enjoy listening.
So I think honestly, it's the taken for granted aspects of how we've defined mathematics and constructed it to be as a field. The fact that we haven't thought about it as a relational practice, that we haven't thought about it in relation to instruction. I think that's my main thing. I think I say this because many of the instructional moments that we're capturing, or the student support moments that I capture in my work, are seemingly neutral. They're not explicitly naming things. And so we hear rhetoric around like, well, I'm not racist if I don't name race, or I'm not homophobic if I'm not talking about your sexuality, right? But I think even the rendering of that silence is a form of violence, right? And so I think part of it is being able to kind of challenge this uptake of math as a discipline as being neutral in this space, and really then honestly trying to develop socially conscious practices that name those things, and you're developing instruction where you aren't marginalizing forms of participation from those who have been historically disfranchised in the field.
To read out some
can I add something, Nisha?
Go ahead.
I think the other thing that we're challenging in the field is methodologies and methods in terms of understanding some of these age-old, problems and issues. So as Dr. Leyva has pointed out, he's bringing to the fore, things that would appear neutral to the everyday eye, right, in mathematics. But oftentimes you have to get creative about the methodologies and the methods that you use, because ones that have, you know, been a part of old school research or mainstream research don't often help us have that critical eye. And that's one of the beautiful things that I love about Dr. Leyva's work are the methodological innovations that he brings, and I tweeted, by the way, that he brings to his work to really advance and illuminate the silences and, you know, queer students of color's experiences in, you know, math and STEM, which, you know, if Kimberly Crenshaw said, if you don't have a framing for a problem, then you can't solve the problem. So Luis's work is really groundbreaking in that it's bringing to the fore, you know, these major issues that queer students of color are experiencing.
I just wanted to draw attention really quickly that for Luis, that there's some examples of these truisms that are in the chat right now, and I'm going to read them out really quickly just to also get your response to them. Brittany says that Black people can't do math. Grace Chan says, here's one specific to STEM teaching, that you have to have been a good student in STEM to be a good teacher, and if you weren't, you can't. Or that being good at math means that you're a more valuable human being than somebody who's not good at math. And then Brittany says that women of color don't belong in STEM. Yes, Grace. Or that being able to solve problems quickly means that you're good or better than others.
Yeah, and I see this too, not even also like in engineering fields, where we think about, Wendy Faulkner has this beautiful piece around the dualisms around the social and the technical. And when we think about like some of the hierarchies within engineering fields and how we construct mechanical, electrical to kind of have these more technical vibes where technical knowledge is valued, we oftentimes have that technical and physical that really is divorced from the social. And so when we think about like civil engineering, for example, that kind of has more social, like you're developing things for a city, right? Like urban planning and things like that. Oftentimes it gets kind of ranked lower on that hierarchy, right? And so even the troubling of how we construct, even in the field as broad as engineering, those subdisciplines themselves have their own cultures, and those get implicated into instructional practices, right? And so really kind of going back to challenging this field and how to, and this is kind of speaking to what Dr. Joseph had shared as well, like how do we do that, right? Like what are the methods that we're employing to be able to do that work?
Awesome. We got a question from Barbara, which is, so how did the revelations and disparate impacts about COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter changing what you're thinking about, or maybe just framing how you are doing this work? I know that we started with
That's Dr. Stengel.
Stengel, thank you.
Yeah.
Yep. Dr. Stengel, thanks for joining. I really do think that it's more about the framing of how I'm doing this. I think that I'm going to be consistent and still approaching this work with being able to kind of stay true to really centering intersectional forms of resilience and agency and oppression in this work through counter storytelling. But I think that with this particular moment in history, thinking about how we can take those individual perspectives and inform structural change where we're not seeing structural changes or structural considerations of how we're approaching education through COVID right now, right? And so how can we begin to, I mean, I'm still working on how do I talk to policymakers? Because I think that that's where the vehicles of change happen. So how can I take this work and talk to those who are going to be informing educational policy to change this game? And so the more intent that I can be with being able to take this work and translate it in a way where I can have communications with those people who are the game changers, I think that that's going to be something. And I also think, you know, part of this is like when we do this work, we're oftentimes talking to each other in echo chambers. When we think about who has access to this work. So, you know, part of what I want to do in my trajectory is being able to think about public scholarship in a way that I think that traditionally in the academy, it's kind of very traditionally not appreciative of public forms of scholarship. And so how do we begin to get the this level of knowledge into the hands of those who are in classroom spaces, for example. So I'm thinking like academic Twitter, which is a whole space, is a form in and of itself, right? So we publish these articles, it goes into a journal, you have to pay for JSTOR, your institution has to have access to JSTOR, right? And then we're writing these pieces around supporting students' identity development or informing teaching practices. And so how can we begin to kind of take these spaces like Twitter, for example, to be able to get and support access for those who are not just the policymakers who are changing this, but also the agency of teachers and student support officials who are also game changers in and of themselves in their everyday professional practices.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely, go ahead.
I'm just curious to know, Professor Leyva, what brings you joy? What brings you joy? It doesn't have to necessarily be about the work, but just as a person.
Well, I think
you do, Dr. Joseph. You bring him joy.
every day of my life. I think I'm trying to think about like these moments that I have where I like just kind of have this moment of like, and like I think even before when I was saying about recharging during COVID, I've begun to take up reading like fiction books, which I never do, and these moments of like being able to I mean, I can never turn off the academic side, so I feel like I struggle with this question because like it never turns off, because I'll watch Netflix and I'm still engaging like in discourse analysis of like how are the typecastings happening here and what plot lines being developed. But these moments where I'm reading pieces and I'm still making sense of it from that space, and I'm making connections where it's not reading a journal article, where it's not reading a grant proposal, and I'm seeing it manifested in just something like fiction. I just think that there's this level of reimagining that we like. Change in the academy, my friends, is glacial. And so if I can find something in fiction where there's this level of reimagining that we're trying to do as equity-oriented researchers, but we can begin to see this in the reimaginings through fiction, that brings me joy, because I actually can then skip over all that glacial pace and get to where I want to be. So I think that would be an example of joy. And old school 90s music, that brings me joy. And I still analyze a lot of the culture around 90s music with the lens. Junior year of high school, I wrote this paper around the social movements of the 1990s in parallel to what's happening in music. So I was like, the uptick of Princess Diana with the Lilith Fair in 1997. So if you're ever curious about any of that, my mom probably has that somewhere back at home.
That actually segues pretty well into the last question I wanted to ask anyway, which is what books have you been reading and want to recommend to us all? And apparently fiction is now on the table.
Let me see. Let me look at what I've got in the. Well, it's not here, so it's not on my windowsill, but I just got, this is gonna take a lot. I'm just starting to get into Harry Potter. And I feel like I've resisted it. I read Sorcerer's Stone, but I also am a little worried that I'm probably gonna take the fun out of Harry Potter for people. So I'm gonna read it and then just ask people questions to tell me. So Harry Potter is number one that I'm thinking about. And I wanna do Lord of the Rings, but I feel like it's too long. So I'll stick with Harry Potter.
Awesome, thank you. I think we've got time for last questions that I want to sort of solicit from other people, just because I don't want to be the last person talking.
So I have a question. So I think it's interesting. So the first time I heard of professors and teachers using social media to connect with students was because I'm also a grad assistant for Teresa Dunleavy, and so she uses that to connect with her students, right? So I think that's super interesting. So like, right, I think the platform seems to be Twitter, in like the math education sphere. So how long has this like been occurring, and like how far do you think the reach is? Like how far, like being like geographically, but then also like within like the age ranges, right? So yeah.
For the reach of Twitter, you're thinking, Taylor?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because it seemed like you also mentioned that you use that, and Dr. Joseph used that to reach students and like professionals in your field.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like the limitations of it. I mean, one thing is the fact that it's a very public facing, it's a very outward facing platform. And so like part of it is like some of the repercussions of like, I mean, even before, like I had said earlier, like when I began to do some of this work, and I published this work, it got taken up in really resistive ways, right? And one of the ways that it did was Twitter. And so I have to always keep in mind that as I'm engaging with Twitter, and this is not just something that happens to me, it's happened to many scholars in our field. And so one of the things that we are doing is because it's so public facing, there's that advantage of being able to put your work out there and being able to share that work and have it more accessible, but you're also broadly having access to that work as well. And so I think recognizing that you're having that conversation, but you're having that conversation with the masses and not just within the smaller confines of your own field. I think generationally, I will say this, Twitter is also a form of therapy for people. And I think that like Twitter, being able to see yourself, oftentimes you might not necessarily see yourself in your own institutional space, but being able to follow other people on Twitter and seeing messages on that space, like I'm thinking about like subcultures of Twitter, like for example, the Black Twitter phenomenon, right? So this is a space of solidarity and also a place of healing, right? And so I think that there's this level of, there's the academic Twitter piece of getting your work out there, engaging with teachers, thinking about your practices, doing podcasts, all these public scholarship pieces. But then there's also these other ways to be able to use Twitter, of being able to follow people who are maybe inspirational speakers, right? Or just people who are just tweeting about their everyday lives, and you're beginning to form these virtual communities of solidarity with one another. So I think that there's these multiple uses, and I think even now, a lot like Instagram is something I've never used, but I think that that's also been a platform that people use to be able to build that sense of community. So I think that now younger generations are really kind of savvy about some of those technological aspects and using it in really creative ways to be able to forge bonds of solidarity that they might not necessarily find in their more immediate spaces.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Well, we're nearing the end of our time. We have 2 minutes to spare. I just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Leyva and Nisha. And also, I feel like I did not properly introduce you, Nisha, so I'm going to do so at the end, guys. But they're a second-year professional student in a Master's of Education Policy program on the quantitative track here. Which I think is super exciting, has also done like really cool work on campus. But yeah, so I feel like you can reach out to Nisha and Dr. Leyva if you want to get to know them better or have any further questions. But thank you all for coming to our Faculty FaceTime Friday yet again. We love seeing everyone. Yeah, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And do you two have anything else to say before we go?
Feel free to reach out. I can put my email into the chat, but you could just Google me and it will come up on the Vanderbilt faculty website.
Yeah. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much. And we'll see you later. We'll see you next Friday. We'll have Dr. Corbett Doyle.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Yeah.